Chaf Beis Mishnah He. Says the Mishnah, Haroichetz b'mei ma'ara. One who bathes in the water of a cave, of a mei Tiberia, or he bathes in the water of Tiberia, in the hot springs there, v'nistapik, and he dried himself, afilu be'ese aluntios, even with 10 towels, i.e. each of the towels hardly got wet. If you dry yourself with 10 towels, then they're hardly saturated. Each one is not really very wet. Nonetheless, lo yeviem biyoda, you still mustn't carry them home in your hands, as we'll see, because we're worried gezeir shemi yischot, you might come to wring out and to do schita, which is an issa tolda of dosh. Now, says the Bartanura, v'nistapek v'kineach, he dries himself, afilu be'esa aluntios, even with 10 towels, sadinim shemekanchin bohen, towels which he dries himself with, v'nistapek bohen ze'achazeh, and he dries himself with one towel after the other, even though each towel hardly gets wet, he mustn't bring them home, even if there's no hitzah problems, there's no problems to carry. We're worried maybe he'll come and do schita. Continues the Mishnah, but 10 people can use one towel. They can all dry themselves, their hands, their faces, and their feet. And they can carry it home. They can carry this single towel, even though, of course, it's going to be very wet because 10 people have used this towel to dry themselves. Nonetheless, because they're all together and they'll remind each other not to do schita, we're not worried about them bringing it home. That's what the Bartanura says. They'll remind each other. Even though it's one towel for 10 people, where there's clearly going to be a lot of water on the towel, nonetheless, they can still bring it home, they can carry this towel home, and they're not worried that maybe they'll come to do schita. Since there are a number, there are many of them, they'll remind each other. And just by the way, the Bartanura continues, it's lav dafka. Urcha the milsen noka, that's the normal when you want to wash and freshen yourself up, you'd wash your face and your hands and your legs. But if all 10 of them use the towel to dry their entire body, and therefore it's very wet, then we're not worried about them to bring it home, where there's no hutzah problems, because we're not worried about schita, because they'll remind each other. So that's the Mishnah, that if one person uses 10 towels, even though there's not much water, we're worried, and he should not bring it home, but if there are 10 people carrying the towels, then they can bring it home because they'll remind each other. That's the Mishnah as it is. Now, there are a couple of ha'aras which need to be made. The first is that given that we're talking about bathing and drying on Shabbos, and it's important to have some sort of background generally about the halachas of rechitza on Shabbos, because it explains the difficulty in the first line of the Mishnah. You see, the Mishnah begins, Haroichetz b'mei ma'ara, of a mei Tveria. And Haroichetz is a lashon b'diavad. If one did bathe, in other words, he wasn't lechatchila. It doesn't say roichetz, it says haroichetz, the guy who did it. Now, that is problematic, because as we'll see, bathing b'mei Tveria is actually more lenient than bathing b'mei ma'ara. Why do I say that? Because it's a Gemara in Shabbos. The Gemara in Shabbos, Daf Mem Amud Aleph, and it's a Gemara quoted in many other places. The Gemara says as follows: Omer Reb Shimon ben Pazi, Reb Shimon ben Levi, Mishum Bar Kapara, in the name of Bar Kapara. Betchila hayiroichsin bechamim shehuch me'erev Shabbos. Initially, it was actually 100% permitted to bathe your whole body in water that was heated on Erev Shabbos. There was no problem with it. The water had been heated on Erev Shabbos. And what was the problem? There's no issa, there's no melach involved. However, hischilu habalonim lahochem b'Shabbos. But the bathhouse attendants took advantage, and they began to heat the water on Shabbos itself. So they were being over the issa of bishul. People were getting hana from water that was heated up on Shabbos. There were major problems there. So therefore, and people would say, Me'erev Shabbos suchmu, and the balonim and the bathhouse attendants would say that we heated this water up before Shabbos. They would lie. So Chazal were wise, and they came along and said, Osra Sachamin. we prohibit, we asa to bathe in hot water on Shabbos. V'hitiru es hazeya, but what we would allow perspiration, literally. It's like a sauna, to go into the bathhouse and to make it a very hot room, and that was a form of bathing, but it's not rechitza, it's called zeya. That was allowed. But people would still they would abuse the system. They would still go into the bathhouse and bathe. And they would say, really, we're actually just perspiring. And in truth, it was a pretext because they were bathing properly. So Chazal came along and they said, no, Zeya, the perspiration is also Asa. But what they did allow was bathing in Chamei Tiveria, in the hot springs of Tiveria. Because they needed to allow people to do something. But people again abused that, and they would bathe in water which had been heated on Shabbos. And when they would say, people would use that as a pretext, and they would lie, and they would say, we actually bathed in the Chamei Tiveria, in the hot springs of Tiveria. So therefore, also Chamei Tiveria. So Chazal again came along, and they said that it's also to bathe in Chamei Tiveria. But what they did allow was to bathe in cold water. Chazal saw that it was too much for people not to have any bathing facilities whatsoever. So therefore, they therefore re-allowed bathing in Chamei Tiveria, but the prohibition against sweating was the sauna stood in its stood. Now, if that's the case, it's mutar lechatchila to bathe b'Chamei Tiveria. So why use the lashon di'evet? So the Mefarshim explain, when it says haroichitz b'mei ma'ara or b'mei Tiveria, really the haroichitz, the b'di'evet, is only going on the mei ma'ara. But enochanami, bathing in mei Tiveria would be mutar lechatchila. That is the first ha'ara. The second ha'ara is also very important ha'ara, and that is that really what the Mishnah tells us is there are two parts. That if one person bathes, even if he uses many towels, and there's hardly any chashash, any concern of schita, nonetheless he should not bring his towel back. Masha'inkin, if 10 people bathe, even with one towel, which would get very wet, there we're not worried about schita because they remind each other. But the halacha is not like this Mishnah, because the halacha is, in fact, if you look at the last line of the Bar Tanura, ve'ein halacha b'Mishnah zu, ela afilu echol meri biyodei aluntis shenistapik bo, that even one person can bring the towel which he bathed in, v'lo chashin shem meyischa, we're not actually worried. And that's the shish, I think, of Rav Shimon in the Gemara, who says that actually the halacha is not like this Mishnah, and indeed in Shulchan Aruch, in Siman Shin Aleph, halacha memches, this is brought, the Shulchan Aruch brings the halacha like the Gemara, not like this Mishnah, i.e. mistapik odin ba'aluntis, a person is allowed to dry himself with a towel, umevia biyodai, and again, assuming there's no hotzah problems, the issue is solely schita, he's allowed to carry it in his home, bring it home, v'lo chashinon shem meyovin lischait, and we're not worried that he's going to come and do schita. So he'll be allowed to bring it home from the bathhouse. Once he's home, then it's a different shayla, he shouldn't carry around, but to bring it home from the bathhouse, that would be in order. That is the end of Mishnah Hey.